Good evening, YouTube, and welcome back to my garage. This evening we're going to continue the project for the 2010 Toyota Prius that I briefly discussed in an earlier video where we talked about the symptoms that is exhibited when these cars have a head gasket failure. We discussed some different kits that we use to actually do the repair. I'm going to break this series down into two parts. Today we're going to be working on the removal of the cylinder head and how to accomplish that. Before we start the video, I would like to give a huge shout out to Andrew Van Norman. A couple weeks ago I had a problem with my borescope camera tool. For some reason I lost picture, and when I turned it into Andrew to be sent out for repairs, I got a return back in like 2 weeks with it fixed. Unbelievably fast. I really appreciate that, man. In the video, I'm going to show how we use that borescope camera, and you can see the actual leak. In this circumstance, we were able to see it actually coming from the cylinder head gasket, and just like I thought, it was very, very minor, but still caused an intermittent misfire concern, and the engine would shake really bad and had that knocking sound that is usually happens first thing in the morning when you start it up. So here we go. I hope you guys enjoy. So this is the borescope kit I use to diagnose the head gasket leak. In my opinion, I think it's by far the best kit to use. I did a lot of research on borescopes when it comes to the Toyota Prius and these vehicles that run a 14 millimeter spark plug. The size of the camera that you have on here, it's got to be small enough to go through the spark plug hole. And the reason I like the snap-on one is because it actually has a camera on the side right here. And I could see things like the valves, I can see the head gasket, and actually I can see exactly where the coolant is coming into the combustion chamber, which is very handy when you're trying to accurately diagnose this condition. So the first step in doing this inspection to diagnose a head gasket leak in a 2010 to 2015 Toyota Prius is you are going to want to put the cooling system under pressure using a cooling system pressure tool. And then we're going to snake the borescope tool down these spark plug tubes after removing the spark plug. In order to get to this point on this vehicle, you're going to have to note that removing the cowl and wiper assembly is necessary to remove the ignition coils, because the cowl will actually interfere with the removal of those coils. So depending upon the severity of the head gasket leak, you'll be able to see the coolant dripping in the combustion chamber, and as we can see, the droplet is starting to form right there where the head gasket mates to the cylinder block. And if you watch this thing, it's going to get big and then eventually drip down into the cylinder. That right there is actually what causes your misfire condition that we experience on startup. And depending on the severity of the actual head gasket leak, sometimes the condition can be very intermittent. Usually when it starts happening, you want to address it as soon as possible, because the more severe it gets, the more risk to the bottom end of your engine experiencing some sort of internal damage. So getting started, the first thing I'm going to do before doing anything else other than draining the fluids, which is going to be your engine coolant and your engine oil, is I'm going to disconnect this little cable right here. This right here is the same thing as disconnecting your negative battery cable, and keep in mind this is very important on this particular car when regarding safety, because when you disconnect these two body grounds, it's possible for ground to backfeed through the starter circuit and allow the engine to crank over on its own. So after we disconnect that negative battery cable, we can continue the project. First thing I'm going to do is remove the intake assembly.
And to all you people out there, you're lucky, because he's a trained Toyota tech. That's it. Well, you know what? After we do this, we'll do them together, Brian. I'll come down on a Saturday and make a video with you.
That'd be cool, huh?
Yeah, I'll be like the old nurse guy. And I'll just kind of try to keep my mouth shut. I'll just kind of help you. Maybe they'll laugh at our interaction. All right, back to the video. That's what you do. All right, what's the next step, Brian? Mr. Toyota man.
So for all you guys who don't know, if you live in Lake County, this is Mike Thompson. He is my boss over here at Fisher Auto Electric.
That's right. And one day, he's going to be my boss. How fucking weird is that? However, Brian, when you was gone, you kind of were my boss.
A little bit, huh? I got to play the service manager role for a little bit, interact with customers. That was a little fun. So after we disconnect the intake assembly, we're going to go ahead and remove it. You have hoses right here that clip into the box. And that's what we have down in here. We're going to, from here, I'm going to remove this part of the intake, and then I'm going to start taking the harness off the valve cover so that we can remove the valve cover. Little tip for you when removing this intake: this little tab right here on the spring clamp can lock here. I like to lock that when removing because it makes it so it's much easier to put back together. And you just, when you compress the thing together, you want to roll so that it moves that tab up and stays locked. Then we can twist and then it'll come off. So we have a couple connectors up here, one for your crankshaft sensor, one for your oil pressure switch, and one for your oxygen sensor. Once you disconnect the harness down here, you can undo this little bracket right here. There's a clip on the valve cover. And then this harness will lift up here, and you can disconnect these injectors. That's for your knock sensor and water pump. And then down here is going to be your air conditioning compressor. So once we have the harness free, we kind of move it up here. And we start unbolting our valve cover. Yeah, that'd be a pretty good video, huh? At least taking the intake off, like what you're doing there for the broken bolt.
Video, but here's another thing. You ever seen green Loctite? That explains why they're so hard in there, but I've never seen green. Have you?
Yeah.
What is that, above red or below red?
It's more of a
blue?
sealer than anything.
Huh. I don't know why they do that for anything. It's not like water goes through there.
No, but they want to seal air.
I wonder why the bolt broke.
So once we get the valve cover unbolted, these little points right here are actually meant for a pry bar to go up and underneath there and break it free. So once you use the pry points, you can kind of lift up the valve cover and get it free. In the last video I mentioned that the Felpro gasket set did not come with some very important gaskets. So I'm going to elaborate on which gaskets it does not come with. This gasket right here is meant for your oil control valve. It controls your variable valve timing and the oil flow applied to this control or cam actuator. The other gasket it does not come with is going to be this gasket right here, which is responsible for transferring oil from the head to the valve cover itself, which then trickles oil on top of these cam journals. They're very important O-rings to replace. This one can result in a check engine light if not replaced. This one may or may not, depending on how long you let it go. It may just result in a misfire because your camshafts grind down and wear out. Sorry about that, everyone. Turns out my camera died. So now that we removed this part right here, the harness is quite free. We can move this out of the way. That right there is your purge valve. And this right here is going to be a map sensor. I usually take this hose loose right here, leave the rest of the purge valve together, and then I disconnect the coolant hoses going to the throttle body. So I'm just going to break all these bolts free. You want to take these two 10mm off of the EGR tube. So now we got to take the lower radiator hose off. Before I do that, I'm going to put this bucket under there because it's going to spew out some coolant. I guess not. You have another coolant hose that goes to the back of the thermostat housing right here. That clamp has to come off. Oops. There's that coolant. So after we pop those hoses off, then we're going to start undoing the engine motor mount. So we're going to have to support the bottom of the engine. We got to take the bracketry apart for the air conditioning. So underneath this bracket here, there's a hidden 14mm nut that has to come off in order to remove the upper motor mount. You can just take it off right here. Makes it really nice if you have a ratchet that has a swiveling head like this. Makes it really easy to get to. This stud right here, you're going to want to remove that in order to remove this engine mount. It's actually not very tight. You can get to it with an 8mm socket and it'll come right out. After that's done, we're going to remove the water pump. Got one bolt on the bottom of the water pump too that you have to access from the wheel well. Oh, that was tight. And then out comes the water pump. Alright, so now that we got the water pump removed, the next step we're going to go about is removing that engine mount bracket on the front of the timing cover. So after we do that, then we're going to remove the harmonic balancer or crank pulley. So the nice thing about this engine is there's no serpentine belt. So we don't have to worry about removing pulleys or anything other than the crank pulley. So after that's done, next step is to remove the timing chain tensioner. Timing chain tensioner is located all the way in the back of the engine here. It's got two 10mm nuts that come off. And out comes the timing chain tensioner. Now this is a little bracket that holds the wire loom. Keep that together. So after that's done, then we can start unbolting the timing cover. Part of the timing cover, we remove the oil filter housing. It's just 4 12mm bolts. So to get this timing cover off, we have 4 14mm bolts, one 10mm bolt that's a little hidden, but not too bad, and then the rest are 12mm. This is not a bad looking engine for an engine that has 200,000 miles on it. Never would have guessed just looking at how clean this engine is. It's really good that we're actually finding this this head gasket leak fairly early. It's really going to prolong the life of this engine. For anyone worried about buying a 2010 Toyota Prius that has 200,000 miles, I mean, look at this. You never would be able to guess this engine had 200,000 on it. These are very good, very reliable, fuel-efficient cars. So after you remove all the timing cover bolts, this engine has pry points on it to break the timing cover free. It is held together with a substance called FIPG. It's a sealer that Toyota uses. It stands for form in place gasket. It is a very good sealer, if applied properly, that is. So you have to remove the timing cover. You want to set up a spot that you could arrange to lay out the timing components, the chain and guides. This guide right here is just slides on. After you take that off, you have a couple 10mm bolts right here. We still have a little tension on this chain. You don't want to let these cams snap back, so you want to kind of roll one just to take a little bit of that slack out of the chain, and then gently let it roll into place. That way you don't bend any valves. It's very important that you do that. Now we're going to remove this chain guide right here. Just two 12mm bolts. So I want you to keep something in mind here too. One important thing to do with these components here is you want to inspect them for cracks. So you got to think that this engine is pretty old, and if these components are cracked, you can wind up with some timing chain slapping noises back there, and you don't want that. Alright, so after that's done, now we can start getting a lot of the EGR stuff out of our way. This could be a little tricky for some. I do have a couple tricks that I use when taking this apart. But all in all, it's really not that difficult. This is a water-cooled EGR assembly. So we have a couple coolant hoses that actually feed into it. You definitely have to disconnect those coolant hoses. Disconnect this fuel line. To do that, we got 2 tabs on each side of the connector. We depress those tabs and then we can pull it apart. This is a returnless system, so you only have one line. We got 2 12mm bolts on the back side of this EGR valve. Well, they're not bolts, I'm sorry, nuts. After you remove those nuts, you're going to want to remove the actual studs that sit back there. As you can see, these studs are the one I'm talking about. There's one on top and then there's one on bottom. It's going to be really hard to pull that EGR assembly out unless you remove those actual studs. So if you end up buying a ratchet that has a head that swivels like this all the way around, it really helps. It makes this part of it so much easier. We got 2 12mm nuts. To hold the actual EGR assembly onto the head. These have to be removed. In addition to another stud right here on the front. So there's also another 12 that sits really deep all the way back here on this EGR valve assembly. That has to come off. Once you get that nut off, this EGR assembly will slide off the stud and then come right out. Next step is we have 2 coolant hoses that goes to the back of the head. I'm going to take the spring clamps loose. And then you have a coolant temp sensor right here, the back of the cylinder head. That's got to come off. So it looks like my camera died on this project again, guys. I apologize for that. So just to give you an update of where I'm at on this project, we have the timing cover removed. I have unbolted the exhaust. It's actually 3 bolts that you need to undo from the back of the head. I leave the exhaust manifold bolted onto the back of the head during removal, and then I remove the exhaust manifold after I get the head out of the car. So from here, we also have our coolant hoses disconnected. This coolant hose is ready to come off after we unbolt the head. We're not going to worry about it at this point. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to start to remove the cam housing. That's done in we have a bolt pattern that we actually have to follow to remove. It usually tells you to remove these 10s and remove the cams, and then you could remove the housing. Me, I don't do that. I just go by the bolt pattern offered to remove these 12 millimeters bolts, and then I remove the cam housing with the cams still in the housing. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So what I'm going to do is just remove these bolts in that sequence shown on the piece of paper right here. Basically, we're removing these bearing caps from the outside, working our way in. Now don't forget, you also have kind of a hidden 12 that sits back here. And then you have this 12 right here that needs to be removed. So after you loosen those 12 millimeter bolts, you're going to take a small pry bar, and there's a little spot right here in front of the cam housing. You're going to pry up on and break it loose from the sealer. Keep in mind you're going to have to work it a little bit in the back. And the camshafts and the cam housing will come out in one assembly. Now what we're looking at here is these are your rocker arms, and underneath the rocker arms right here is you're going to find a lash adjuster, and then right here is a little bucket for the lash to keep the valve lash within specification. Now it is an automatic adjusting valve lash system, but it is important to make sure you put these in the same exact place. Not because that they're different widths, but because you want to assemble a valve train in the same position in which it has worn. So I just keep everything organized one by one as I take it out. Alright guys, so from here all we have left to do is unbolt the head. Something to keep in mind, we also have a loosening pattern to follow when removing this head as well. It's imperative that we do that to keep the head from warping. That way we don't have to end up buying a new head. So basically the bolt pattern for removal is going to be a crisscross pattern working our way from the outside in. It's the same way we took the cam housing off. This is exactly where the bihexagon socket is going to come in. This is what it looks like. Hey, how's it going? No worries.
Right here, obviously, right?
Yep, appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem, brother.
All right. So that was my spark plugs coming in for this project. Now, I've heard a lot of stuff about people doing head gaskets and saying, oh, don't do a head gasket job unless you're going to replace the bolts. Well, there's a little bit of half-truth to that. You absolutely want to make sure that you follow the manufacturer instructions when it comes to the recommendation for head bolt replacement. But when it comes to these cars and most of Toyota products, head bolts are actually reusable. You just want to make sure that the length of them are within spec for them to be reused. These washers are very important to make sure you keep accountability of. You want to make sure that you install the head bolts with those washers. I just take a magnet to remove them. They come off fairly easy. Okay, so now we just need a medium-sized pry bar. We're going to pry up on the head to kind of break it free a little bit. Now you got this hose. Oh. I forgot about this bolt here. This is an easy one to sneak up on you guys too. There's a bolt right up underneath the hose that needs to be removed. It just holds a wire loom. So if you're careful, this head is not terribly heavy. You can work that hose out and remove it as an assembly.